Chapter 1 continued. And then learned from her sister in Spokane that he had suffered a heart attack. Friends said Kathy was deeply depressed the day of her disappearance. Her moodiness led police at first to believe that Kathy Parks, like Donna Manson, might have killed herself. For a week after she was reported missing, they searched the vicinity for her body, even dragging a nearby river bottom. When they discovered nothing, a flyer was issued and sent to regional police agencies, just as similar data sheets and photos had been routinely issued for the 3 previous victims. It was all routine. An agency like the Seattle Police received notices of missing young women at the rate of about 1 per week in the mid-1970s. Since the cases usually were outside Seattle's jurisdiction, there rarely was a reason to pay much attention to them. The flyers were posted as they came in, one on top of the other. A case from 260 miles to the south in another state was even less likely to raise any interest. The next victim, the first of 2 Miss Junes, might not have died if she'd been sober. Unlike the other victims so far, Brenda Ball was not a student. At 22, she was also the oldest victim to date. Ball had spent much of the night of May 31st, 1974, at the Flame Tavern in Burien, a working-class town wedged between Seattle and SeaTac Airport to the south. The Flame was a tough, seedy joint set up on cinder blocks and known for the rough crowd that hung out there. Fistfights commonly broke out in the parking lot. Noise complaints were routine. Every month or two, the police would receive a missing person report, listing the Flame as the last place the person was seen. At around 2 a.m. on June 1st, closing time, Brenda Ball bid a beer adieu to her fellow patrons and walked out of the Flame in search of a ride. She had talked earlier of hitching to a state park to meet some friends for the weekend. Brenda could take care of herself. She led an unstructured life open to adventure, and she was largely free of inhibitions. Not until June 17th was the King County Police Department notified by her friends that Brenda was missing, last seen at the Flame. Meanwhile, the second Miss June vanished. On page 1 of the Seattle Times' June 12th editions, under a photograph of Richard Nixon and Anwar Sadat waving to a crowd of cheering, dusty Kairounis, the little that was known of Georgia Ann Hawkins was reported. And then it's like a little excerpt, like of a news article. UW co-ed 18 disappears on way to sorority. Police were seeking information today about an 18-year-old co-ed who disappeared early yesterday in the University District. Georgia Ann Hawkins of Lakewood, near Tacoma, last was seen after she left a friend's residence to return to the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority shortly after 1 a.m. yesterday. The friend said she left via an alley. She told him she was going back to the sorority to study for a final examination. Several acquaintances reported seeing and speaking with her as she walked back toward the sorority, but she never arrived, and friends became concerned about 3 a.m. When she failed to show up for the final examination, friends began telephoning friends and relatives, according to a sorority supervisor. Georgia Ann is an absolutely stable and dependable girl, the supervisor said. It would not be like her to leave without telling her roommates or her friends. Toward the bottom of the article came the first tentative public suggestion that a serial killer was loose. Quote, police said they were looking for any possible links, the reporter wrote, between the disappearance of Miss Hawkins and the January 31st disappearance of Linda Ann Healy, 21, also UW co-ed, end quote. Georgia Ann Hawkins was a conventionally pretty girl with soft brown hair and an infectious, beaming smile. She was also exactly the same height and weight as Susan Rancourt. She also had poor eyesight. Hawkins also had been a cheerleader at Suburban Lakes High School just south of Tacoma. In her senior year, Georgia Ann won a popularity cum beauty contest. She was voted her school's Daffodil Princess, an annual honor bestowed upon one girl each from several Tacoma area high schools who preside at the court of the local Daffodil Festival. With her selection also went Georgia Ann's opportunity to ride with her sister royals aboard a float in the Spring Daffodil Parade. through downtown Tacoma. She was any man's idea of the sweet all-American girl. At the university, she was a B-plus student and somehow also found the time and opportunity to be quite tan by finals week. The night of June 11th, Hawkins had gone to an end-of-term party where witnesses said she drank no more than 3 beers. Georgianne hadn't worn her contacts that night, nor did she bring along her keys. By prior arrangement, she was going to awaken her roommate by throwing pebbles against the windows of their room. After midnight, Hawkins walked partway home from the party with a girlfriend, then stopped for about a half hour to chat with her boyfriend at the Beta Theta Pi house. She left by the fraternity's alley-side exit and then stopped again for maybe 5 minutes to speak with another Beta brother, whose upstairs window was open on this warmest June night. She then had less than 300 feet to walk down a brightly lit alley to her sorority house. At about the same hour, witnesses later recalled, the tall man wearing what appeared to be a leg cast and stumbling along on crutches was seen in the vicinity. He had with him a briefcase, which he kept fumbling and dropping. Descriptions of the man later offered to the police were very similar to the reports which came in later of the stranger with his armload of books who approached Jane Curtis and then Kathleen D'Olivo just before Susan Rancourt disappeared in Ellensburg. He had come full circle back to his home turf, Seattle's University District. As Georgianne Hawkins walked along, she peered forward intently, her vision without her lenses as poor as Susan Rancourt's had been that night in April. Along the way, many students' windows were open onto the alley, and at least 2 groups of people saw the co-ed walking along the middle of the alley, where the streetlights shone the brightest. One witness, a fraternity house mother, reported that she heard a high, terrified scream that night, but no one else reported hearing or seeing anything. Georgianne Hawkins' sleeping roommate didn't hear any sound at all from the darkened area below her window, where Georgianne was to have stopped and tossed pebbles at their window. Somewhere in the last 30 or 40 feet of her walk, a space where the lamplight was much less intense, Georgianne vanished. One instant she was there, alive, and then nothing. The next morning was Captain Herb Swindler's first day as the new head of the Seattle Police Homicide Squad. A balding, archetypically gruff cop with 30 years' experience in everything from pounding a beat to busting narcotics traffickers. Swindler was no stranger to multiple homicide. He had worked as many as 18 different murder cases at one time. Out of the hundreds of homicides he'd investigated over the years, only once, he claimed, did Swindler fail to identify the killer. This would be the second time. He looked over the preliminary report on Georgianne Hawkins and shook his head in disbelief and recognition. Though assigned to another division throughout the preceding months, Herb Swindler had taken a professional interest in the several reports of missing girls around the region. He hadn't seen a pattern exactly, but he had noted the negative link, the one factor that was consistent throughout each case. There was no evidence. Now, confronted with the Hawkins disappearance, Swindler pondered for a moment and then asked his sergeant for the homicide unit's files on the other missing girls, including Linda Ann Healy, who already was a Seattle PD case. To his surprise, there weren't any other files. Apparently, Swindler, alone among the Seattle police, wondered if there was a connection among Linda Healy and Donna Manson and Susan Rancourt and Kathy Parks and Brenda Ball and now Georgianne Hawkins. Late in June 1974, Swindler and investigators from 30 other regional police jurisdictions gathered in Olympia to discuss their cases. No consensus was reached on whether a pattern of murder was discernible throughout the Northwest, nor was discussion limited to Healy, Manson, Rancourt, Parks, Ball, and Hawkins. The collected detectives brought dozens of unsolved, quote-unquote, open disappearance and murder cases to the meeting. The Seattle area alone listed 29. Sorting through them, a detective could find what he was looking for, a common thread or no thread at all. Yet the fact that such a meeting was called was reason enough for the Seattle Times and other papers to speculate on the significance. Stories linking some of the cases began to appear, all carrying the obligatory quote of skepticism from an official source. No one was yet ready to imagine the worst, not even reporters. Cops like Herb Swindler might harbor their private fears, but could not articulate them for public airing. It would take another attack, a bold daylight double abduction, to finally ignite the terror. A rare, utterly blue sky greeted Seattleites as they rose on Sunday morning, July 14, 1974. The sun, so commonly a stranger, radiated a luxuriant warmth that loosened the libidos and bathed the region in a welcome glow. The temperature climbed into the 80s by midday, tropical weather by Northwest standards. People lingered abed, dawdled over breakfast, skipped church, and forgot about washing the car. It was an ideal day to go to the beach. Swarms of sunbathers, swimmers, and picnickers, an estimated 40,000 people in all, converged on Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular recreation facility about 12 miles east of Seattle, by way of US 90, the road to Ellensburg. That Sunday, Lake Sam, as it is known, was a riot to the senses. There was a Seattle police picnic at one end. A local brewery was sponsoring its annual beer party, complete with music and sports contests, including a keg-throwing competition. Water skiers zipped along the shoreline as toddlers gamboled in the shallows. Frisbees whirred through the air. There was a pervasive smell of suntan oil, charcoal, and burnt hamburgers. For Janice Ann Ott, 23, July 14th began with a trip to the Sud Shop laundromat across the street from her house in Issaquah, about 5 miles east of Lake Sammamish. Striking, with green eyes and reddish blonde hair that fell straight to just above her waist, Jan had been married since December of 1972 to Jim Ott, who, in the summer of 1974, was living in Southern California. Jan was living with a roommate. Both husband and wife apparently required a lot of space. As she waited for her clothes to dry, Jan struck up a conversation with Sud's shop owner, David McKibben. She told him she was a probation officer and that she had lived in Seattle until her residence was burglarized. That's why, she explained, she'd moved to Issaquah, a smaller, safer community in Jan Ott's estimate. McKibben would also remember that Jan Ott hadn't been wearing a bra that morning. They agreed to walk down the street for a cup of coffee. After coffee, McKibben headed home and Jan went back to her place to change into her black bikini. Over the swimsuit, she pulled on a pair of Levi cutoffs and a white blouse she knotted at her midriff. On her feet were blue and white deck shoes. Her husband, Jim, later told police that Jan was a punctual, compulsively organized person. True to her nature, that morning she left a note on her front door. I am at Lake Sammamish, son and myself, Jan Ott. Then she climbed aboard her yellow 10-speed and pedaled away. At noon, about the time that Jan Ott arrived at Lake Sam, Janice Graham, 22, married, a clerk typist at the Boeing Company, was standing near the park bandstand, waiting to meet her husband and parents. A young man approached her. Ms. Graham guessed he was 24, 25 years old. He was wearing a white t-shirt with red trim at the neck, and if her memory served, he had on blue jeans. His left arm was in a sling, and he was holding it tightly against his body. He didn't offer her a name. He told the young woman he was waiting for some friends who were supposed to help him load his sailboat onto his car. Gesturing at his arm, he casually explained to her that he had injured it while playing racquetball. Exploiting this conversational opening, he asked Janice if she ever played the game. No? Well, you should try it. It's lots of fun. With his arm immobile and his friend's no-shows, the man wondered if Janice might help him with his boat. She was willing. He seemed harmless enough, and they began to walk toward the parking lot. This is out of sight, he exclaimed. At one point, there are so many people. According to Mrs. Graham, her acquaintance had curly, sandy blonde hair that he wore short on the sides and longer in the back. She estimated he was 5'8" or 5'10" and weighed 150 to 160 pounds. When they got to his car, quote, a newish-looking Volkswagen Bug, metallic brown in color, end quote, She saw no boat and no trailer. "Where is it?" Janice Graham asked. "It's at my folks' house just up the hill," he replied. "Oh," she said, I really can't go with you. I have to meet my husband and folks. What time is it?" He consulted his watch. It was 12:20, he told her. Janice was already 5 minutes late. She had to get going. "That's okay," he said cheerfully. "I should have told you it wasn't in the parking lot. Thanks for bothering." They walked back toward the park. He repeated his apologies and expressed his gratitude. "He was very polite at all times," Mrs. Graham said in a later statement to police. "Very sincere, easy to talk to. He was real friendly, and he had a nice smile." Janice and the polite stranger parted company about halfway back to the bandstand. He continued forward toward the beach, and she turned to the concession area. 10 minutes later, as Janice Graham stood eating a snow cone in the shade of a concession stand, she saw the polite fellow again. He was walking toward the parking lot once more. Beside him was a woman whom Graham couldn't see too well, but she remembered the woman had a yellow bike with her. It looked like a 10-speed. Janice had two thoughts at the moment. One, this guy was a pretty fast worker. Two, I wondered where he was going to put the bike. Down near the water's edge, Janet had found a good spot for Sun and herself. Sylvia Valent, 15, and her two high school girlfriends were stretched out next to Ott, not 2 feet away. Sylvia had watched the new arrival put down her knapsack, spread a white towel on the sand, peel off her cutoffs and blouse, and sit down. She produced an orange-colored jar and carefully applied cocoa butter from it to her skin. In a few moments, Valent saw a man approach Ott. From the teenager's ground-level vantage, he looked to be 5'6" or 5'7", of medium build, and was darkly tanned. She described his hair as blondish-brown. It came down to his neck, and he parted it on the side. He was clothed in white tennis shoes, white socks, white shorts, white t-shirt. His left arm was in a sling. According to Ms. Valent, a cast was extended from his wrist up past his elbow. "Excuse me," she heard him say to Jan Ott. "Could you help me put my sailboat onto my car? I can't do it myself because I broke my arm." To Sylvia Valent's ear, his voice carried a small English accent, kind of like a fag, quote-unquote. Janice Ott looked up, she said, and eyed her visitor for a moment, then smiled. "Well, sit down, let's talk about it. Where's the boat?" He told her it was at his parents' house in Issaquah. "Oh, really?" she replied. "I live in Issaquah." For the next 10 minutes, Janet and her new acquaintance chatted. Sylvia Valent could hear every word. The blonde on the towel, she told the cops, said she was Jan. The stranger introduced himself as Ted. Housewife Tracy Sharp, who was sitting with her 5 children about 5 feet from Janet and Ted, later said, "Didn't think Ott was buying his line." The pretty blonde was somewhat curt, even caustic. Yet she eventually stood up, put on her cutoffs and blouse, and walked away with him. Witnesses remembered hearing Ted assure Jan how easy it was to learn to sail. She made him promise to introduce her to his parents. The witnesses provided a remarkably consistent portrait of a slim, smooth-talking stranger who could make the unlikeliest stories sound plausible, or at least inviting. They differed on significant details of his height, hairstyle, and facial features, as if Ted were a chameleon capable of changing his appearance at will. But they all agreed on the 2 most significant facts: the approximate time that Ted arrived on the scene, and that he carried his left arm in a sling. Imperfect as it is, human memory was to give the police their first solid leads in the case. Of course, by then it was too late for Janet, but Ted wasn't finished for the day. At approximately the same time he was leading Janet away to her death, 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslin was sitting with her boyfriend and another couple in a Seattle tavern. Denise was in a sour mood. She and her boyfriend, Kenny Little, 23, had been partying that weekend. Sunday night, they had been out quite late at a card game. Denise had wanted to stay even longer, but Kenny insisted they go home. Then they received an early call from their friends, Nancy Batema and Bob Sargent, who invited them along on an outing to Lake Sam. Denise didn't want to go. She was tired and needed to prepare for a Monday exam in her computer programming class. She was serious about not wanting to be a secretary all her life. Kenny, however, wanted to go to Lake Sam, and Denise generally tried to please him. A few days before, she had asked Little his favorite color. He said blue, and Denise promptly changed her nail polish color to blue. An attractive, dark-eyed girl with long brown hair, Denise took great care with her appearance and was rewarded with the male attention she enjoyed. When she and Nancy went to bars together, Denise often sat at a table by herself so that men could notice her and ask her to dance. Usually that was as far as she went with them. She's not the type that talks a lot, Nancy Patema told police. She doesn't seem to be overly impressed by any guy. She wouldn't go out of her way to talk to anybody, nor would she go out of her way to avoid anyone. Denise regularly used drugs. According to her friends, it was rare to find her without a supply of downers. On the way to Lake Sam in her tan Chevy, a gift from her mother, Eleanor Rose, Denise popped 4 5-milligram Valiums. Her companions each took a number of pills as well. At the park, she seemed to be enjoying herself. The 4 friends met some others they knew, mingled in the crowd a bit, had a snack at the concession stand, and drank beer from the big ice chest they'd brought along. They also passed around a joint. Meanwhile, Ted had returned. 16-year-old Cindy Seidenbaum's police report. Quote, approximately 4 p.m., a man who was walking toward me said, "Excuse me, young lady, could you help me launch my sailboat?" I then asked him what he had done to his arm. He stated that he had sprained it and he couldn't find anyone to help him. I told him I was sorry, but I couldn't help him because I had people waiting. I think his eyes were either green or blue, and he looked bug-eyed and set back. His pupils were real small. It appeared to me that he was nervous. He spoke rapidly and gestured with his hand. His left arm was in a sling. He was wearing a sort of bleached white boxer swimming suit with elastic for a waistband. His body had a full tan. He had a sort of pointed nose and thin lips. Next, he approached 19-year-old Pat Turner, who had come to the park with her boyfriend Nick. Turner was on her way to the public restrooms at about 4:15 when he walked up to her with the story about the sailboat. She wasn't feeling well, too much sun, and told him she wasn't interested. The guy seemed friendly, though, she said. He was good-looking, but Turner acted as if she didn't understand him and then walked off, probably saving her life. By 4, the temperature at Lake Sam had pushed into the 90s, and Denise Naslin grew languorous. She told Nancy she felt high and then dozed off in the sun in her fadedly cut-offs and dark blue halter top. Shortly, Kenny fell asleep too. Nancy remembered that Denise awoke about 4:20 and they chatted for a few minutes. Then suddenly Naslin rose and walked off toward the restrooms, where still another witness would place her at about the same time. Kenny awoke a half hour later to discover Denise gone, and he immediately sensed trouble. Her purse was in the trunk of the car, and Denise went nowhere willingly without it. Kenny and Bob and Nancy began to search the park. Twilight approached, and the crowds began to thin. Still no Denise. Darkness fell. They called for her, asked people if they'd seen her. Nothing. At 8:30, they gave up. Kenny called the police, who told him that a person must be gone for 24 hours before he or she is even a candidate for a missing persons investigation. Besides, he was told a relative must initiate the report. When Kenny Little pulled up to Eleanor Rose's house that night in Denise's car, her mother ran outside in a panic. Little was barely able to get the story out before Mrs. Rose was back in the house and on the telephone. I told the police I know Denise would never take off and leave her car. Eleanor Rose would remember. She was so happy when I bought that for her. Or leave her purse. She took too much pride in how she looked. I knew something happened. The following afternoon, Jan Ott's roommate reported the parole officer missing too, and suddenly that gorgeous Sunday at Lake Sam took on an unnerving new dimension. Where were Jan and Denise? Divers were dispatched to search the lake bottom for the young women. Police helicopters crisscrossed above the park and surrounding countryside, using infrared scanners in search of bodies. On the ground, police and volunteers scoured the park, searching for clues, anything, and apprehensive over what they might discover. Among the hundreds of items turned in for laboratory analysis were 26 pairs of women's underpants picked up throughout Lake Sammamish State Park, but no trace of Jen or Denise was found. Primary responsibility for investigating the twin disappearances fell to the King County Police, who also were handling Brenda Ball's unsolved disappearance of the previous month. Captain J.N. Nick Mackey headed up the county police investigative unit, but almost from the start, and for 15 long years to come, the point man on the investigation was Detective Bob Keppel. 31 years old, slender and intense, the bespectacled Bob Keppel had handled but a single homicide as a detective in his 4 years with the county police. All at once, Keppel and his fellow detectives were charged with finding and stopping the most notorious serial killer in the region's history, destined to become the most famous killer in the country. Mm. 31 years old, slender and intense, the bespectacled Bob Keppel had handled but a single homicide as a detective in his 4 years with the county police. All at once, Keppel and his fellow detectives were charged with finding and stopping the most notorious serial killer in the region's history, destined to become the most famous killer in the country. At first, Keppel had discounted the possibility of a single killer stalking the region. He knew of the many similarities between the Hawkins and Rancourt cases, but he said it was incomprehensible that someone would cross over Snoqualmie Pass. It's such a geographical barrier. Keppel positively did not connect Brenda Ball with the other cases, but the medical prop MO began to change his mind. The use of the sling at Lake Sammamish was clear. Witnesses reported a man on crutches in the University District that night, the night Georgianne Hawkins vanished. Later, the county detective would see that Linda Healy's bed with its hospital corners fit the pattern, as did the use of the speculum as a weapon on Mary Adams. It was Keppel who, with the help of Alfred Pickles' secretary, reinvestigated the Rancourt case and found Jane Curtis and Kathleen D'Olivo, the Ellensburg co-eds, who had separately encountered the stranger with the finger splint and sling. After interviewing the girls, Keppel had no choice but to concede that Ted not only might have abducted Susan Rancourt 120 miles east of Seattle, but that he traveled that great distance over the mountains at least twice to go hunting at Central Washington State College. The process then became deductive. If Ted killed Healy, Manson, and Rancourt, then it was logical that he'd taken a victim in May. Keppel and the other county detectives reviewed all the missing female cases for May, and then eliminated each possibility until they came to Roberta Kathleen Parks. Connecting her to Ted seemed even less probable than linking him to Susan Rancourt. Parks disappeared 260 miles away from Seattle in another state, but by now, Bob Keppel wasn't going to discount any possibilities when it came to Ted. He'd requested copies of Kathy Parks' dental and medical records. Herb Swindler, in charge of the Healy and Hawkins cases, publicly refused to connect them with the Lake Sammamish abductions or any other missing girls, even though he was more certain than ever that Ted was a multiple killer. The newspapers, however, were undeterred by Swindler's and other officials' efforts to avoid panicking the population. A well-known Seattle psychiatrist was quoted as saying Ted, if he was a multiple killer, probably was, quote, a pretty sick guy who needs to boost his ego by throwing the population into terror, end quote. Failing to find a local cop willing to speculate, reporters interviewed police in distant cities. "You folks have a problem," said a Denver detective after a reporter summarized the several cases to him. "I've never run into anything like that," commented a police sergeant from Phoenix, who added, "Sounds to me like you're dealing with a real nut." Predictably, such stories and the evident lack of progress in the case spread alarm throughout the population. Nick Mackey held periodic news conferences in which he promised that every lead would be followed. Tacitly conceding that the investigation was going nowhere, he pleaded for anyone who had been at Lake Sam with a camera that day to please bring his film downtown. Thousands of feet of news film and hundreds of snapshots were shown to the witnesses, but none of them recognized Ted. With no positive identifications, a series of composite sketches were published. One of the drawings, executed by an artist as Bob Keppel sat nearby, looked just like the detective. Close parentheses. Along with the information that Ted might drive a Volkswagen and that he spoke with a slight British accent. Thousands of calls came into the police, many of them of the crank variety. One man reported seeing Denise Naslin riding Janice Ott's bike in downtown Seattle. Another offered the use of his body-finding machine. Frightened women reported Ted sightings by the hundreds. Men who resembled the composite pictures or owned a Volkswagen or were named Ted found it advisable to stay home. In one grimly ironic incident, Linda Healy's younger sister Laura was accosted by a strange man at her job in a photomat booth. She called her mother, who dispatched brother Robert to pick her up. The police who arrived at the scene before Robert noticed his Volkswagen that he vaguely resembled one of the Ted composites. The police nearly arrested him before Laura could explain that Robert was her brother. In the absence of any concrete leads as to Ted's identity, many Northwesterners thought the answer would be found in occultism or Satan worship, which enjoys small but ardent followings around Seattle. One rumor, given broad currency, was that Ted had been a Jesus freak gone insane after a trip to South America. The theory was that Ted believed himself to be the reincarnation of a broken-winged Inca bird god. Herb Swindler wasn't buying anything so outrageous, but neither was the frustrated investigator above checking out the occult angle. Working quietly and for the most part alone, he put together what became File 1004, a dossier on area occultism. In the end, the effort led him no closer to Ted, but in the absence of anything more substantive to go on, he felt obliged to try. Swindler took a lot of criticism from the county police and prosecutor's office for his probe into the occult. Yet, from the perspective of retirement, he still defended the interest he took in the subject. The weirdest thing about these homicides was the lack of any information, he said. That was really strange. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. We don't have a body. The earth just opened up and swallowed the girls down. At the same time, quote, this occult stuff was hot and heavy all over. Anything was possible as far as we were concerned. We didn't have anything. The occult sounded as good as anything else we had. In fact, it sounded better because there was such a definite pattern to the known disappearances. Swindler emphasized the word known. He also consulted a psychic, Regina Hoffenbauer, from nearby Kent, Washington. She scared the hell out of me sometimes, Swindler admitted. She was sort of weird. Hoffenbauer spoke with the missing girls' families and handled various items of the victims' belongings. The idea of dealing with a psychic was anathema to Joyce Healy. That she cooperated was a measure of her desperation. The psychic predicted that Ted would kill 11 girls, then move on. That number is very close to the probable count. Most Northwest police think that he killed between 12 and 18 women in the region. Hoffenbauer told Swindler that several of the bodies would be found east of Seattle, that George Ann Hawkins had been dumped in a riverbed, and that Janice Ott and Denise Naslin lay together on a hillside. Early in August of 1974, a construction worker sat down for lunch near a road project on US 90, where it passes through Issaquah and begins the vertiginous climb up past North Bend and over Snoqualmie Pass. He found a place to sit on a hillside and opened his lunch pail. Immediately, the stench of purifying flesh filled his nostrils. He quickly moved away, thinking someone must have poached a deer or even a black bear, perhaps having left the animal's innards to rot. He thought wrong, but by the time he came forward with his story, potentially valuable evidence was lost. The summer wore on with no progress in any of the cases. No new disappearances were reported in the press, and the number of newspaper articles fell off. There was little or nothing to report, and Richard Nixon's resignation dominated the front page. The searches for Ott and Naslund were suspended. Labor Day came and went. Bird hunting season began. It is the time of year in the Northwest when local medical examiners expect reports of grisly discoveries that nearly always turn out to be the remains of elk, bears, deer, dogs, or any of a number of other animals that died in the woods over the summer. Sometimes during this bone season, the remains are human, but then usually from ancient Indian burial sites. In early September of 1974, however, the Issaquah hillside that had reeked so in August yielded up a discovery that sent fresh shockwaves of terror throughout the Northwest. September 1974 was the first day of grouse season. Elzie Hammonds, 36, loaded his shotgun and drove over to pick up his neighbor, Elzie E. Rankin, 71. The hunters headed out in Hammonds' Jeep for Issaquah and a certain hillside where Elzie had bagged 2 grouse the previous year. There was good hunting around in there, he excitedly told Rankin. Around 10 that morning, Hammonds was walking along an abandoned logging road that cut across the slope. The road was overgrown with weeds and heavy underbrush lined both sides. Moving as slowly and as quietly as possible, Hammonds inched forward until an object right in front of him made him freeze. His stomach knotted. There, grotesquely splayed across the road, was a skeleton, its yellow-brown bones still connected in most places by a desiccated sinews. A few feet away he spotted what was obviously a human skull. Hammonds hustled down the hillside to find his friend Elzie Rankin talking with a pair of young target shooters. When Elzie told them of his discovery, they laughed and assured him he had probably found animal remains. Hammonds knew better. "If you don't believe me," he said, "come back with me and I'll show you." The 4 returned to the logging road. On the way, one of them caught sight of a long hank of dark hair, almost 2 feet long. It took just one look at the bones and the doubters were convinced. They scurried into town and notified the Issaquah police, who in turn called King County detectives. By noon, a team led by Bob Keppel had cordoned off the hillside and began a search of the scene. News of the discovery made the September 8th newspapers. They carried initial reports from police indicating that none of the bones discovered in Issaquah belonged to the missing women. Eleanor Rose, Denise Naslund's mother, heard of the discovery on her car radio and immediately dashed to the scene. As she stood at the bottom of the hill, her fears were allayed by the early news. The cops didn't think Denise was up there in the brush. "We're so very glad, so relieved," she told a reporter. By the time they had finished, the searchers found 26 bones in all, and 8 clumps of dark brown and reddish blonde hair, strewn over an area about 150 feet across. From the position of the bones, it was evident that the bodies had been dumped farther up the hill, then were dragged down piece by piece into the brush by animals. There were gnaw marks on the bones from coyotes, rodents, possibly even bears. Among the finds were 2 spines, a skull, and 2 lower jaw bones. No jewelry or clothes were found. The police had assuaged Eleanor Rose's worries on the basis of the nearly perfect upper teeth found in the skull. Denise had had a good deal of dental work, but Mrs. Rose's relief was short-lived. Dr. Darius Swindler, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Washington and a distant relative of Herb Swindler, took 2 eternally slow days to make the identifications. From x-rays and dental records, he concluded that, beyond a doubt, one of the lower jaws belonged to Denise Naslund. He used dental records to identify Janice Ott as well. But he would remember something else about Janice Ott, a fustian tableau in his study. The skull he was given was radically elongated, the result of a premature closure of its main cranial suture. She would never have known about it herself, he said. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just a thing that happens occasionally. Dr. Swindler cradled the bleached skull in one hand and compared it with Jan Ott's photograph. They matched, an image in life and the substance of death. It was, he said, an eerie feeling. An extra femur or thigh bone was found at the site too. It definitely was female, meaning a third girl had been dumped there. Years later, it would require Bundy himself to establish her identity. That was about all the police would learn from the hillside. Janice Ott's bike was never found. It seemed likely that the girls had been killed elsewhere, but no certain cause or time of death could be established. All that Ted had left for the police was a collection of ravaged bones, hair, and sinew, silent mocking testimony to the fate of his victims and the helplessness of his would-be captors. In piteous distress at losing her only daughter, Eleanor Rose asked the King County Police if she might have Denise's remains for burial. A compromise was worked out. The Seattle Times reporter was on hand on a characteristically gloomy autumn Saturday when Eleanor, her son Brock, and Denise's father came to Holy Family Catholic Church to hear Father Sean Hennigan say the Mass of Christian burial for Denise. The correspondent noted that several detectives attended the service as well. Bob Keppel and the other investigators had brought Denise Naslin's remains from a police evidence locker. They sat in the church watching the small group of mourners in the hopes that Ted, whoever he was, might come to the service. Father Hennigan spoke of the, quote, useless, senseless death that had happened to Denise. He closed by reading a letter she had written to Eleanor after her 1973 graduation from high school. Dear Mom, Denise wrote, I can't put into words everything you have done for me. In my life, I've had so much more than some people ever had. I've been very lucky. The priest blessed the casket and the service was over. Then Keppel and the other officers collected Denise's few bones and tufts of hair from the bier and returned them to the evidence locker downtown. Until the case was officially solved, Denise was police property. Winter came to western Washington, and the game hunters left the forests. For the next several months, there would be no more discoveries and no more reported disappearances. The Northwest newspapers didn't fix on this apparent halt to Ted's predations. They continued to treat him as a palpable threat to the area's young women. The level of fear in and around Seattle did not subside. Yet the police noted the break in Ted's pattern. After Lake Sam, there was no Miss August or Miss September, no Miss October, no Miss November or December. Bob Keppel began to suspect Ted had left the area, just as Herb Swindler's psychic predicted he would. Maybe, Keppel thought, Ted was a merchant seaman. If so, Seattle and the region were safe again, but so too would be Ted. His identity might never be known. So, 1974 ended and spring approached. The days lengthened and hikers and fishermen ventured out. Another bone season was about to begin. On Saturday, March 1st, 1975, a call came into Bob Keppel's office. 2 forestry students, he was told, had stumbled onto a skull in the wilds 10 miles east of Issaquah and 4 miles to the south of US 90. The discovery had been made on the lower slopes of Taylor Mountain near the town of North Bend. Keppel gathered up his records, the x-rays and dental charts he'd collected and studied the previous summer, and sped to the scene, a damp, slippery incline covered with brambles, rotting logs, and saplings. All along, he'd been sure that another dumping ground would be found. This time he hoped Ted might have left some trace of himself, some tangible clue. To date, all Keppel had been able to do was to clean up after his quarry. Earlier, there had been another find near Taylor Mountain. Herb Swindler's people had turned up some animal bones in an old house. Still working his occult angle, Swindler wondered if they were goat bones, indicative of black rites. Instead, Dr. Darius Swindler had identified them as the remains of an immature elk. But a human skull was something different. Keppel saw to it that the entire mountainside around the skull was sealed off, and then sent the bare remains to Seattle for identification. The next morning, the report came back. Brenda Carol Ball, 22, last seen alive at the Flame Tavern, had been murdered and dumped on Taylor Mountain. Her skull had been fractured. For the next 8 days, Keppel supervised 200 police and volunteers as they scoured the mountainside inch by inch. Their work was tedious, hideous, and in the end, heartbreaking. Keppel himself made the second discovery. The detective was negotiating the steep slope when his feet slipped from beneath him, sending him tumbling down through the tangled underbrush. He landed in a heap covered in muck and wet leaves. Keppel grunted, stood up, and saw before him Death's face, 2 empty black eye sockets staring frozen on infinity. Death was smiling at him with pretty expensive teeth. He knew instantly that he'd found Susan Rancourt. He looked more closely and saw that Susan's skull had been cracked. Next came Kathy Parks' skull. The beauty from Oregon State University had been brought 260 miles north and dumped for the animals to eat. The last to be identified was the first who had been murdered. Joyce and Jim Healy's eldest child, Linda, the blue-eyed ski report announcer, was there on Taylor Mountain, too. According to her mother, she was identified on the basis of a single tooth. The forensic experts who examined the bones could not say with certainty how the girls had died. If the cranial fractures came from human blows, however, some would have required a heavy blunt instrument such as a tire iron, wielded with incredible fury. Other factors were more clearly understood. Ted had dumped the girls near the roadside after removing all jewelry and clothing. Then the animals had begun their work. Soft, fleshy parts of the bodies were consumed near where they had been left. Then the heads and jaws were torn away and carried back into the brush. Along the way, a hank of hair or a lower jaw might drop off. Farthest away from the road were the skulls, which took the scavengers the longest to penetrate and devour. Bob Keppel felt he could infer a sequence. The early victims had been brought one by one to Taylor Mountain. The only girl among them whose remains were not found or identified was Donna Gail Manson. That was another mystery Ted would clear up, partially, in time. In June, he had apparently abandoned this dumping site and began using one closer to Seattle, Issaquah. There, resting with Denise Naslund and Janice Ott, was the unidentifiable femur. Taylor Mountain was the last Ted dumping ground to be found, although others may exist. It established beyond reasonable doubt that he had hunted for months through the Northeast, murdering almost at his leisure. What it did not establish was who Ted was and where he was, now that the victims had been found. Bob Keppel had assumed he'd left the area, and Bob Keppel was correct. The previous September, Ted Bundy had moved on to Utah.